Welcome to Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm Ben Forstag, Managing Director of Mac's List. On this week's bonus episode, we're listening to an interview Mac did on the Making Oregon podcast. This interview comes from July 14th, that's Bastille Day, and was recorded by host Terry St. Marie.
Welcome to Making Oregon, the podcast that brings you conversations with innovators, makers, and groundbreakers from all across our state. They talk with us about what they're doing to make Oregon the best place we know to create a diverse and prosperous economy. Hi everybody, I'm your host, Terry St. Marie, co-founder of Built Oregon. In this podcast, we examine how to build a business or career driven by purpose. I recently stopped by the office of Portland's own Mac Prichard, founder of Mac's List. Mac's List started as an email to keep in touch with colleagues, and today is an Oregon jobs board that attracts 80,000 people. But that's not all. In addition, Mac founded Prichard Communications, a business that helps philanthropic organizations get their message out. I talk with him about what it takes to run two demanding companies at the same time. I ask Mac about his background, how he developed his work ethic, starting with a paper route when he was 9, and how his desire to be of service to others has shaped his career. Now, Mac knows firsthand what it's like to be unemployed. He'll explain how he developed the skills it takes to find a job. Those lessons became the foundation not only for Mac's List, but for the platform he has built, which includes his online jobs board, a blog, a book called Land Your Dream Job in Portland, and now a weekly podcast. And also coming soon, an online course for job seekers. He'll explain how he's built a platform and a brand by helping to solve problems for the people he serves. Listen in as Mac explains why everyone with a career is an entrepreneur, why setting goals is critical, how to network, and why you have to tap into the hidden job market. Because, listen to this now, 80% of jobs are never advertised. Finally, Mac has always been interested in politics and has worked on many campaigns over the years. He'll explain why a campaign is the perfect example of a startup business and why learning from failure makes us all better at what we do. So without delay, I'm pleased to introduce Mac Prichard. Hello, Mac. Great to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Terry.
So let's start as we would normally do in an entrepreneur story from the beginning. Now, you're a Midwesterner, just like me, from Iowa, correct?
I am. I grew up in eastern Iowa in Davenport.
In Davenport. And how would you say that childhood and your upbringing and the values of the Midwest, which I'm well familiar with as well, how did that sort of form your sort of value set that sort of led you to where you are today? I'm always curious about that.
Yeah, I think my values come from my parents and my family primarily, though I did go to parochial school and Catholic high school, and the education I got there shaped me as well. Work ethic was really important in my family, and so my dad signed me up for a paper route. I was age 9, carrying the Des Moines Register. And I've really been working ever since.
Since 9?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was there bookkeeping involved? I've heard through other circles that you were a bit of a nerdy type. And I mean, was that sort of that really was something you could get into because it involved? Doesn't paper routes, you have to keep books and you have to keep track of all the papers that you were delivering and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, you do. There were weekly collections, so you had to knock on people's doors. It was Thursday on that route and collect the bill. And then there were subscription drives, so you would do cold calls trying to persuade people to buy subscriptions. And then you had to get up at 6 a.m. before school to deliver the paper. And you had to do it every day, because if you didn't, you heard about it.
Wow. I mean, there's so many things about that experience, Mac, that I could say, well, gee, I can see in you today that some of the discipline involved with that and the sales part of that. To have started that at age 9, how significant of experience did that turn out to be when you look at that in hindsight, to have that sort of immersion and then knocking on doors and interacting with people and having conversations. And what did that stir in you that led to other things down the road?
Well, I think it helped with my political career. Later, I worked on a number of electoral campaigns, and that's all about talking to voters and persuading them to support your candidate. And being comfortable doing cold calls is a vital skill for anybody running their own business.
Cold calls at age 9. Now, that is an interesting thought to imagine. So after that, did you graduate from high school in Iowa and then moved on?
I did, and I went to the University of Iowa and then moved east after working on a U.S. Senate race in Iowa. And I had 3 passions in college. I wanted to write, I wanted to work in election campaigns, and I wanted to be involved in human rights advocacy. So I got to do, I've been fortunate to be able to do all 3 throughout the course of my career. And after college, I did work on a U.S. Senate race, and then I went east to work for a human rights organization that worked with the media on U.S. Latin American policy. And I learned how to pitch stories, how to write. I helped start a newsletter. And I learned a lot about media relations, and that served me well in my career as a communications professional, working in government and politics and nonprofits, and now running my own firm.
So what was it when you were in college that led you to that spark to say, this political thing, this was something that I felt I was good at or I could help with, and use my writing skill and use my personal skills? I'm always curious as to where that spark comes from.
Well, in Iowa, with the caucuses, during the presidential campaign, you have a chance to see candidates up close. And I actually skipped high school my senior year to go to political rallies. That was part of it, but also it was the example set by my parents, particularly my mother. She was a special ed teacher who started the Special Olympics in our community when that was just getting off the ground. She also was involved in her local union. She was in the bargaining team first it was the National Education Association and then the American Federation of Teachers. And she, for fun on weekends and during the week, would go down and lobby at the state capitol. So that was a very—
For fun?
Yeah. So that was a very powerful example. And later she became the president of the statewide professional association for special ed teachers in Illinois. We lived right across the river from Illinois. So that she provided a powerful example of service and a passion for politics that I think was certainly shaped me.
Yeah, that clearly rubbed off on you in a big, big way. And then there's the writing side. Did you write for like the newspaper or anything in college? Or was there a particular piece, and I ask this because I think everybody has this as a writer, was there something you wrote that really, that other people read that really sort of said, okay, I'm a writer, I can do this?
I did contribute to the high school newspaper. I was a stringer. I wasn't on the staff. I just enjoyed writing. I kept journals when I was in grade school and high school, and my grandfather was editor-in-chief of a publishing company. He was a great role model. And his father, my great-grandfather, had written a number of textbooks and had been a college professor. So that was something I was aware of, and it was part of our lives.
Yeah, all these influences, Mac. This is really fascinating. So you took all this, graduated from college and moved out east. And that must have been a big change to go from Iowa to Boston. That's kind of 2 very different environments.
It
Even
is.
Politically, too.
Yeah, and I worked in Washington, D.C. for 2 years after college, and then took a job in Boston with a second human rights group. We took members of Congress on fact-finding trips to Central America. This was in the 1980s, and what drove these trips was we thought that if these policymakers could see what our organization had seen through its development work in El Salvador and Nicaragua, they would come to similar conclusions. And the reason they came on the trips with us was because they could get a trip through the State Department anytime, was that we had contacts with the Catholic Church, with independent groups, and then we could arrange meetings in third countries with leaders of the armed opposition. And the State Department couldn't do that. So that gave us a great advantage in attracting members.
Holy cow. So you're down there in South America touring people around in not so these were pretty big hotspots at the time of political turmoil, I would say.
There were civil wars going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and it was a tough time for those countries. Tens of thousands of people died in El Salvador and thousands in Nicaragua, and it was those were for people who live there not safe places.
And what did you draw from that experience then when you got done with that and you came back and okay, now was there a now what moment after that? Because that's pretty deep and meaningful, and so many layers to that in terms of what you were doing. And so I'm always curious as to what happens next.
Yeah. There were a couple lessons I learned from that experience, Terry. The value of personal and direct experience. The lawmakers who came on these trips, they became involved in the issue and they became leaders. And another lesson was there's no substitute for personal stories, and hearing from people directly about their experiences profoundly affected the people who came on our trips. But a third lesson I remember being at an event in Nicaragua, and there was a table of people in our group, and we were full of advice for the Nicaraguans about what they should do and how they should fix this or how they should fix that. And there was a lady at the table, I can't remember her name, but she said, a Nicaraguan who said, well, this is great, but you got a lot of problems in your own country. Why don't you go back and work on those? Because we got this. And the lesson I got from that was just there was a lot of work to be done in the United States. And in part because of that experience, it inspired me to get involved in local and state government back in the U.S.
And you did that in Boston for a while?
I did. I worked for a transportation project as a spokesperson. It's a great introduction to Boston politics. It was Boston's Big Dig. I was their first.
The Big Dig.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Yeah.
That's legendary.
Yeah. It was the largest public works project in the U.S. at the time. And then that job led to a position in state government with the Massachusetts Office for Refugees and Immigrants. We help refugees resettle in the state. But I want to pause because my career was not just a 45-degree angle. There was a long period of unemployment after I left the human rights group in Boston before I ended up at the Big Dig. And it was I had that experience because I didn't really know how to look for work, Terry, and because it's a skill that we're not taught in high school or college. Most of us just learn it by trial and error. And so I was out of work for 8 months after having had these great jobs, and it was a surprise and a wake up for me.
So how did you, without that knowledge and without that sort of experience or knowing where to look, so how did you approach then finding work? And it must then, in the end, have influenced where we're sitting here today then.
It has. I asked for help, and my wife, Chris, was working at Northeastern University in Boston, and she asked if a colleague of hers at the Career Center would talk to me. And I'm embarrassed, I don't remember this lady's name, but she helped me through the basics of goal setting. And we talked for about an hour, and she laid out how to do informational interviews, and which is a way of having conversations with people about a field that you're interested in and beginning to identify whether that might be the kind of work you want to do. And that experience led me to get clear about what my goals were, because I was struggling with that. I wasn't sure what to do next after all these great jobs. And I decided to explore the idea of working in local and state government in Boston using my media relations and organizational skills. So I began having conversations with people who were part of that world. And within about 2 months, I got the job at the Big Dig.
Oh. So you filed that away. You got that job. You went off and started working on this. You kind of filed your experience away, the lessons that you learned in being unemployed. And how long did that last? And when did the transition to come to Portland come about?
Well, I went to graduate school at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I got a master's in public administration after working at the Refugee and Immigrant Office at the state. And I did that because I was reaching a point in my career where I wanted to get some formal training in things that I'd been doing, both electoral politics and communications. And I knew it would be a great experience. I was fortunate enough to get in. And after earning my degree, my wife and I wanted to leave New England. It had been a great time, but we were ready for a new adventure. And I was very taken with the idea of coming to Portland. And there was a problem, though. I'd never actually been here. So I started making calls and sort of networking over the phone. And I did come out on a couple of trips. And I was attracted to this place because of the quality of life, and because of the politics and the government. And there were just a lot of interesting things happening here. This was back in the early 90s, in the summer of 91 when we arrived.
So you came to Portland, Oregon. And did you have a job when you got out here, or did you settle in and then look? I'm always curious about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something people should get clear about wherever they want to move, whether it's to Portland or another city. And some people are comfortable just showing up, and others want to have a position in place. And my deal with Chris was, my wife, that, yeah, we would have a job. So I did get an offer in June of that summer, and we moved out here in the August. And but that offer came after a large number of conversations and informal meetings.
So you're already applying some of the lessons you had learned than your previous bout of, let's say, unemployment. So I have to ask then, okay, you got here, and how long did that job last before you then said, okay, I'm going to go off on my own and start something on my own, which obviously led to Mac's List and Prichard Communications? Sure.
I worked as a communications director for a Portland City Councilor who was running for mayor, and which was what I wanted to do. And then that led to positions in Oregon state government for the next 9 years. I was a speechwriter to a governor and a spokesman for different state agencies. And then I got a position at Portland State University working on a national program that reforms juvenile courts around the country. And after doing that for 6 years, the foundation that was funding it said, look, we love working with you and we'd like to continue to do so. We're going to stop funding jobs like yours, but what would you think of striking out on your own and helping us with these contracts? And I managed 2 big national contracts for them with public relations firms, one in Denver and one in Los Angeles, both fine agencies. But the experience taught me that I was just as bright and could as the people who were running these firms, and it was an opportunity to grow my own firm. And that's how I started Prichard Communications. Mac's List was a side project. It was something, and I think for the benefit of your listeners, if they haven't visited maxlist.org, it's an Oregon job site now that attracts 80,000 people. But when I came to Portland, I'm sorry, let me restate that, Terry. When I came to Portland State, I wanted to stay in touch with my friends in the state capitol. And so I started a very small list of just a few dozen names, and I would send job postings to people because I'd learned it's important in your career to stay in touch with colleagues. And over the years, that list grew very slowly, but by 2010, 9 years later, we had about 4,000 names, and it became something that we monetized.
And what was that moment where you thought, well, I'm doing something, I'm solving a problem for somebody in a sense that I can now make a business out of it? At what point did that happen?
It came after the fact. So here, let me paint a picture
after
here.
After you started making money, you really realized it was a business.
Yeah, and so it was always something I did to serve others and to help others. And it became a part-time job by the end of 9 years. I actually was paying someone to maintain the list, and I wasn't receiving any revenue. And I thought, well, I've got to find a way to at least cover these costs. And so we put up a website. We sent out with a way that people could buy listings. And we sent out an email just to one to employers, and we said, well, we've been doing this, we love doing it, but we have to cover our costs. So these are our prices, and we hope that you'll continue to work with us. And what we found, Terry, was that employers started buying listings and in fairly large numbers pretty quickly. And when we asked them why, they said, well, look, you're making our life easier. You're saving us time and you're saving us money. And what employers would tell us is that you've created this community largely through word of mouth, and it's people in Oregon who are well-educated, who are interested in professional positions. So we don't hear from a lot of people when we advertise on Mac's List, but we hear from the right people. And when they said when they posted on big national boards, they'd hear from people all over the country. And most organizations simply didn't have the budget to bring candidates out. But they still had to wade through all those resumes. So with us, they might get 25 resumes, but 20 of them were right. With a big national board, they might get 500 resumes, and 20 of them were right. But they had to go through 480 to find them. So that was the advantage we offered. And that's been, I think, our central strength is that we've created, again, by word of mouth, this community in Oregon of professionals who are interested in doing creative, rewarding, meaningful work.
So it's a business driven more from purpose that ultimately became profitable as a business, but it was really driven by purpose, your desire to help people find work.
Yes, and I've had a lot of different jobs in my career, and now I run two businesses. But the common denominator that runs through all of them, Terry, is I've tried to make a difference about issues I care about, or try to make a difference in the community where I live and work. And the people who work at my two companies, one is Mac's List, and the other is Prichard Communications, which serves nonprofits, foundations, and purpose-driven brands. We share that value. We want to make a difference. And Prichard Communications is actually a certified B corporation, benefit corporation, and we're in the process of having Mac's List make that transition as well. We expect that to be done in a few months.
Wow, so you're operating on several fronts. So having running two businesses at the same time in the same place. How do you make all that work? I mean, most people have a hard enough time running one business, much less two.
Well, I think to do it well, and I've made more than my share of mistakes, so I've learned a lot from experience. But to do it well, I think you have to invest in finding the right people and find and invest the time in hiring and do a lot of interviews and check people's references. And then once you get the good people in place, and I'm fortunate to have two very strong leaders, one who manages Prichard on a day-to-day basis and the other who manages Mac's List, your job and your life gets a lot easier.
So finding the right talent then is, would you say, is the secret to really juggling all this, right? And I mean, is there, you oftentimes you're trying to match people, but I think from the standpoint of the employer trying to find the right person, I mean, you're on the other side of that to some degree because you're asking people to list for jobs. But what would you say, since you've had an opportunity to do this and you said you've made your share of mistakes, so what would you say would be the really keys to finding the right people that match to your organization and to your values? And
I think it's posting a listing on a job board, whether it's Mac's List or some of the other local or national sites out there, is one step in the hiring process. Mm-hmm. But you also have to invest in getting the word out through your own personal networks and through word of mouth. And once you find a good pool of candidates, you have to spend the time to get to know them and see if it's a good fit or not. And I've also learned, and I think most managers and owners learned this long before I did, the importance of just, if it's not a good fit and somebody's not going to thrive in your organization, it's okay for people to move on because they will thrive somewhere else.
And that's got to be one of the hardest thing that someone who is obviously cares about people, has served people, who wants to find people work. Probably one of the hardest things to actually have to do is to deal with that sort of thing where you have to say, this isn't working out. How do you keep the humanity in that?
You treat people the way you want to be treated. Yeah. And sometimes you have to have difficult conversations and make hard choices, but you try to do it in a way that if you were on the receiving end, that you would want to be treated.
Well, and I think that's really good advice. Let me pivot a little bit to more of the mechanics of what you're doing here today. Now, Mac's List started as a list, and it's a job posting, but it's really a platform now where you're doing a lot of other things. So how this is interesting from a gestation of a business standpoint and developing a brand, because it sounds like it's really a brand that you're leveraging in many different ways now. And can you explain a little bit how that's evolved? I think it's kind of an interesting story.
It did begin as a list, and for many years it was simply an email that you got sent via an Outlook account. We turned it into a newsletter in 2008, and then it became a website 2 years later. And now, Terry, in addition to the job board, we have a blog about job hunting. We have a book called Land Your Dream Job in Portland. We'll be bringing out a national edition next year. We have a podcast a show every Wednesday morning that appears, and we talk to career experts who provide nuts and bolts advice about job hunting. And we're getting ready to launch our first course online. The reason we do all these things is to meet the needs of our readers and our listeners. And the problems that they have are what drive the creation of the content and the products and services we offer. And most people start when they're doing a job hunt by looking for openings. And that's a smart thing to do, and you should do that. And you need to look not only at Mac's List, but there are a lot of great Oregon job boards out there. PDX Pipeline, there's something called CRNG, there's ideallist.org, which has an Oregon section. Mm-hmm. So, and then you'll often find these niche boards that are for particular professions, graphic design, coders. So invest the time, find those sites, keep an eye on them. But here's the one fact every job seeker needs to know. Most jobs are filled by word of mouth. And there's no conspiracy here. It's human nature. We hire people we know, or we hire people who are recommended to us by people we trust. And often that connection can be a very weak tie. It could be as simple as you or someone else having a conversation or meeting someone at an event, but there's a connection that's made there. So our challenge when we're looking for work or we're hiring, and no one knows for certain, but up to 80% of all jobs may never be advertised. Our challenge is, how do we spend our time? Most people spend 80 or 90% of their time looking at job boards, and they're missing out on all these jobs that are never posted publicly. Mm-hmm. So how do you find those jobs? We're not taught how to look for work in college or high school. We learn it by trial error, or we don't learn it very well at all. And so the products and services that we offer at Mac's List have grown out of that need to figure out, how do I manage my career and how do I find my next job, and what do I do once I step away from the computer and I stop looking at job boards?
So it's really consumer, to use that word, consumer-driven, in that you feel like you're just responding to the need or the needs of your constituency. I mean, they need to know more about this, I guess other people call it a hidden job market.
Yeah, they do, and they need to know how to navigate it. And people who have successful careers figure it out. And it's like any skill. You just need to invest time in learning it and practicing it, and then you can get really good at job hunting.
So the platform just becomes a mechanism of finding these people where they are or where they usually go, and then delivering this type of education to them. And is that really the thing informing which directions you go in as far as the product is concerned and the brand?
It is. It's driven by the needs of the people we serve. And so we serve employers by getting their listings in front of a community of talented, well-educated professionals who are looking for interesting work. And we serve the needs of our readers, the job seekers, and most of our readers, we know from surveys, aren't actually actively looking for work. They're thinking about their career and their next move. So we serve both active and passive job seekers by giving them actionable ideas, and that will help them solve their problem, which is typically what finding their next job or figuring out what they want to do next in their career.
Wow. So you're going to go where your customers tell you, basically. So where do you think it's all going to end up? I mean, paint a picture for me a few years out. What's Mac's List going to look like then?
I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to grow our national reach by serving more job seekers outside of Oregon. And I think this will happen in part, Terry, because we're beginning to attract a national audience for our podcast. Sure. More than 85% of our listeners are outside of Oregon. And they informally, with these, we're learning these aren't people who want to move to Portland, Oregon. They're just people who are hungry for good information about how to find the next job or manage their career. And so I think we can help them from Portland by being a digital publisher and giving them books and blog posts and courses and other content that will give them the information they need to find jobs with meaning and have careers that have purpose.
Wow. So do you ever think about I'm sure you do, the environment that you're in. I mean, you're not the only person or company in the world offering advice in this field. There's a lot of other places people can go to get this kind of advice. Why? This is like a startup question, actually, more than why should people trust you to give them information that's usable?
Well, I think in any business, you have to build a relationship with the people you want to serve, and trust doesn't come overnight. It's something that's earned, and we found that we earn the trust of our readers and our listeners by giving them good information that's reliable that they can use. And so it's a journey that people go through before they buy any product or service, and it takes time to build that confidence. But I think by putting the needs of our customers first, whether they're employers or job seekers, and thinking about how we can help them solve their problems, we will earn that trust.
And I think that's valid, but I also think, and I will say this editorially, folks, because I've known Mac for several years now, and I've done podcasts on the side, and I think a lot of it has to do with the people behind the brand too, Mac. I think there's an earnestness and honesty and let's say a genuineness that comes behind what you do. I think that's attractive to a lot of people. I've been in those rooms. I've been at those events. I've seen people that use your stuff. Yeah, it's good information, Mac, but I think it's the people that deliver it too. And I think that goes to your history, your background, and wanting to serve people and understanding when I think about and when I invite the listeners to do that, I think you're a great example of leveraging experiences that you've had throughout your life to pull it into something that's meaningful and purposeful for you, that serves this wonderful purpose, but that is still a reflection of you. Did I nail that, or am I?
Well, thanks, Terry. I'm blushing a little bit, but again, I think both myself and the people on the Mac's List team and as well as the team at Prichard, we want to make a difference.
Sure.
And I think that's a common desire for all of us. We all want to make a difference in our work and in our relationships with others, and that certainly drives our work.
Well, congratulations on the success of it. But I do want to ask a couple more things before we have to sign off in more of a general sense. I'm oftentimes told that running a startup is like a political campaign. And I thought if there's anybody I could ask about that analogy, and if that makes sense, it would be you, since you've had a lot of political experience. Why would a political campaign be sort of a good example of that?
Well, it starts with a small group of people. It's usually the candidate and her family and friends and around the kitchen table, and the money typically comes from the people around that table, the seed money. It often can seem like a really crazy idea. I think about one friend who I didn't know well at the time, who invited me to be on his steering committee, and it was a Sunday afternoon. I drove across town, and I got there a few minutes before we were to start, and it was 45 minutes before anybody else came.
Wow.
And so if you had to predict who was going to win in this highly competitive legislative primary, and he had 3 well-funded opponents, you would not have picked him, perhaps. So in the beginning, it looks like the odds are stacked against you. You have to build systems and processes quickly, maybe 6, 12, 18 months. The budgets can vary. It can be tens of thousands of dollars. It can be millions. But whatever the size of the campaign budget on election night, in Oregon, we have vote by mail. So we know when the polls close, or when the voting is closed at 8, by 8:30, we know if we had a sale or not, whether the candidate won. The other thing I think that is about political campaigns is you can work on some losers, and you'll learn from every experience, and you're not stigmatized for working on losing campaigns.
That's a good one there, yeah.
And there's a community of people who do this, and as with any profession, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but you learn from every experience, and you have the opportunity to go on to the next campaign. Nobody is going to say, "I'm not going to hire you because you worked on that losing Senate race or that House race." I mean, obviously, if it was a disaster, but that is the exception, not the rule. And so I think failure is one of the best ways to learn. And being in a field where you're not stigmatized for being a failure, I think is a powerful thing.
And that's not dissimilar from the thinking these days in the startup and entrepreneurial community, that noble failures, or I would say failures where there's a lot of lessons to be learned, where that founder or that person can then turn around and apply those lessons to something else, I think is almost, I wouldn't say preferable at this point that someone has failed, but I think failure is definitely can be a benefit to a lot of things, especially finding the right kind of career choice or right kind of entrepreneurial project that you want to work on. It seems like it certainly informed you, the things that didn't work for you.
It has, and you also get you meet people who are on their way up in that world, whether it's politics or the tech community or any startup, and those relationships, if you maintain them, will serve you well later in your career.
Sure.
I think, for example, I worked on a gubernatorial race in 1994 in Oregon. And I was in my mid-30s at the time, and I took a week off to work on this campaign. And I got sent out to this with this group of people in their 20s to do field work. And cell phones were so novel that when this phone rang, we had one. Nobody knew how to answer it.
Well, there is a good story.
But the reason I tell the story is I think about the group of people I was out with. One of them is they're all middle-aged now. One of them is an elected official here in the region. Another was the press secretary for the mayor. A third is chief of staff to someone at the city council. There's someone who's now on the city council. So as in any profession, you'll meet people on the way up. And if you maintain those relationships, that can be very valuable.
Oh, I bet, because those are bonding experiences in a way, right? You really get some long-lasting things.
Yeah.
Well, Mac, I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but I do want, before we close, and I want to ask one more question, and it's more germane to a lot of our listeners, because obviously you've had a great opportunity to survey the economic and job landscape by virtue of what you do over the past several years. If you were to give Oregon job seekers some advice as to, what challenges they're likely to face, and then what they can really do to prepare for this, or to have a greater understanding of this job market here, what would you tell them?
I think the thing I see job seekers struggle with, not only in Portland, but I've got professional relationships across the country, so outside of the state, is getting clear about their goals. What is it they want to do next? And often people have 2 or 3 ideas, but they feel they have to choose one, and you don't. You can explore 2 or 3 goals simultaneously, and you can do that through conversations with people in those fields, and you will quickly learn just by listening to yourself and where your energy goes, where you want to be. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is you don't, even if you don't own a business, if you have a career, you're an entrepreneur. You have to think about yourself as being in charge of your career. And not only think about your short and medium-term goals, but how are you going to manage your career? Because ultimately, nobody else is going to do it for you. So if there's 4 things I could encourage every job seeker or person thinking about managing their career to do, it would be 1, get clear about your short-term goals. 2, volunteer in your field or outside your field, but just get out of your office, and it could be helping with if you can do it in your area of professional interest, you'll meet people and make relationships and hear about opportunities others won't. 3rd, network. Go to those professional meetings on a regular basis and just be part of your professional community. Again, you'll uncover jobs that are only filled by word of mouth, but you'll also get great insights into your career, and that will inform your goals. And the 4th thing I'd encourage people to do is when they are job seeking, think about how they're spending their time. If you have up to 80% of jobs are never advertised, are you spending 80, 90% of your time at a job board? Because if you're doing that, you're missing out on what might be your dream job.
Oh, well, that is some very, very good advice out there. And Mac Prichard, I'm so grateful for you taking the time to talk with us today. What an interesting and wonderful story. And I hope our listeners today can take a lot out of it, because I know I did. So, Mac, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's an honor to be here, Terry. I appreciate it very much.
I want to offer my thanks once again to Mac Prichard for spending time with us today. And a special shout out to Ben Forstag, the managing director of Mac's List, who's kind enough to record our interview. Many of you will want to follow up on information that Mac laid out today. We'll have all the links on the Making Oregon podcast page, but you can get started by checking out maxlist.org, where you will find his weekly Find Your Dream Job podcast, and you can download the book, Land Your Dream Job in Portland. For those who need strategic communications planning for their purpose-driven venture, check out PrichardCommunications.com.